Good morning, one and all present here. Now we are going to start the free paper session. The session will be chaired by Dr. S. Anandakrishnan. He is an HOD of psychiatry in Teni Medical College. Teni, okay? Over to you, sir.
Good morning. Shall we start the sessions? So for each paper, it's 5 minutes and 2 minutes for the question.
Okay, now we are going with the offline presentation. First presenter is Gurala Priyanka.
Good morning, everyone. My name is G. Priyanka from Bhaskar Medical College, final year postgraduate. And my study is a study of prevalence of anxiety in healthcare workers during COVID-19 pandemic. Introduction. An outbreak of novel coronavirus was initially reported from Wuhan city in China in mid-December 2019, presenting with pneumonia of unknown etiology. The World Health Organization declared this outbreak as pandemic on 11/3/2020. The outbreak of the disease has put a lot of psychological pressure on different communities and especially healthcare workers who are in a direct contact with the patients. And anxiety is a group of mental disorders characterized by the sudden feeling of intense fear, panic, shortness of breath, chest pain, restlessness, GID problems, insomnia, fatigue, muscle tension, sweating, loss of memory, blurred vision, and impaired learning. Occurs often in response to a stressful situations, becomes pathological when it can no longer be controlled or occurs without a real threat. Need for the study. The emergence of COVID-19 has affected the healthcare workers' psychological and mental health. Few studies have been reported on the psychological effect on healthcare workers. The COVID-19 has enormous negative impact on healthcare workers' psychological health, fostering issues such as anxiety, depression, and sleep disturbance. Aim to study the prevalence of anxiety in healthcare workers in a tertiary care hospital during COVID-19 pandemic. Inclusion criteria, people who gave consent for the study and age above 18 years. Exclusion criteria are those who didn't give, those people with neurological disorders. Materials and methods, study design is cross-sectional study. Subjects, people who are working in a tertiary care hospital. Study setting is Bhaskar General Hospital, Moinabad, Telangana. Type of sampling is consecutive sampling. Sample size is 159. And measuring instruments are like demographic questionnaire and Hamilton anxiety rating scale. Results like in my study, it showed that mild anxiety levels are 46%, moderate is 34%, severe. Other studies are like Chenje and Lai et al. And I compared my study with other social demographic profiles like student for males and females, that is using by student t-test, which showed the mean value is less than 1, that is significant. In females, it is mild anxiety is 22% and moderate is 45% and severe is 33%, whereas in males is mild is 68%, moderate is 18% and severe is 14%. These are the studies which supported that females are more prone for anxiety compared to the males. And another demographic profile like marriage versus severity of anxiety, which showed the no significant differences in anxiety between married and unmarried people. In married people, mild is 39% and moderate is 35% and severe is 26%. In unmarried people, mild is 52%, moderate is 26%, severe is 22%. Studies which showed the anxiety levels in married and unmarried people, these are the other studies. And profession versus severity of anxiety, that this also showed no significant differences between non-doctors and doctors. In that, non-doctors have mild is 39% and moderate is 31%, severe is 30%, whereas in doctors it showed 47% of mild anxiety and moderate is 32% and severe is 21%. Studies which reported that anxiety in non-doctors and doctors like other studies. And type of family versus severity of anxiety, no significant differences in anxiety between joint and nuclear families. In joint, it showed mild is 46%, moderate is 34%, severe is 20%, whereas nuclear showed mild is 42%, moderate is 30%, severe is 28%. Studies reported where the levels of anxiety in joint and nuclear families. And limitations, it is a small sample size. And conclusion is healthcare workers suffer from moderate to severe levels of anxiety during COVID-19 pandemic. Females showed increased levels of anxiety compared to the males in our sample. Healthcare workers are more vulnerable to serious mental illness if no prompt interventions are offered. Monitoring and timely treatment of these conditions is of utmost importance. Thank you.
The paper is open for questions. My question to the presenter is, what are the tools you have been using for this study?
Hamilton rating scale, sir.
Based on which, how you differentiated the severity?
Scoring we took, sir.
Okay.
Less than 17 is mild, and 18 to 24 is moderate, and above 24 is severe, sir.
So what is your suggestion based on your study findings?
Sir, we have to give the psychological issues before only to the persons who are going for COVID-19 pandemic, because we are the most vulnerable people at the time of pandemic. We got directly in contact with the patients, even with the relatives also, we need to take care of them. So
have you tried any counseling sessions for them based on your study findings?
No, sir, I didn't do it, but.
Any other questions from the floor? We can ask, right? Main aim of presentation is we have to think a lot, do more researches, so we can ask questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
The next presenter is Kartika Selvi. Please come to the dais. Good morning, one and all. I'm Kartika Selvi from PST Institute, Coimbatore. I'm here to present my audit on the quality of psychiatric assessment on patients who get admitted following a suicidal attempt. Psychiatric evaluation is very essential for patients who get admitted following a suicidal attempt. Information obtained enable the psychiatrist to identify the specific factors that may alter the risk for suicide or other suicidal behaviors, address the patient's immediate safety, and determine the most appropriate setting for treatment, to develop a multi-axial differential diagnosis to further guide planning of treatment. Documentation of suicide assessment is a basic necessity. There are good guidelines which provide framework for assessing the patients with suicidal behavior. These are the APA guidelines, NICE guidelines, and the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry practice parameters. The aim of my audit was to evaluate the meticulousness of the psychiatric assessment documentation done on patients who had made a suicidal attempt. 30 consecutive patients who are referred for psychiatric evaluation following a suicidal attempt from 1st January 2020 were our subjects. Using a structured pro forma, socio-demographic details, clinical details, information about the suicidal attempt, the exact documentation of psychiatric evaluation were extracted from patient's medical record. Keeping the practice guidelines published by the American Psychiatric Association on the assessment on treatment of patients with suicidal behavior as gold standard, the quality of psychiatric assessments were audited. We audited the documented assessment under the following headings: psychiatric diagnosis, assessment of lethality, assessment of intentionality, patient's view about the suicidal attempt, patient's view about surviving the attempt, eliciting any ongoing suicidal ideas, specific treatment plan, specific appointment made, and the follow-up attendance by the patient. These were the results. The mean age of the study group was 32.33 years, and higher proportion of them were females, accounting to 56.66%. Most of the patients had consumed poisonous material orally, and impulsive attempts were made by 76.6%. Our psychiatric evaluation, 30% of patients did not have any diagnosable psychiatric disorder. Our audit reveals that an attempt to make a formal psychiatric diagnosis was done in all patients. Regarding the documentation,
Assessment of lethality was available only in 53.3%, assessment of intentionality in 80%, patients' view about current suicidal attempt in 60%, patients' view towards surviving the attempt in 50%, documentation about further suicidal ideas in 73.3%, specific treatment plan in 90%, specific appointment given in 80%, and number of patients who attended at least one review was only 10%. So, systematic assessment were done in all patients looking for diagnosable psychiatric disorder. However, the details needed to assess the suicidal risk were not documented in majority of patients. Lethality only in 53.3%, intentionality only in 80%, views about current attempts were only in 60%, views about surviving the attempt was 50%, and ongoing suicidal ideas in 73.3%. It is possible that during the assessment, these themes could have been discussed, but not documented in the record. Nevertheless, failure to document may give the reason to conclude that they weren't done. A specific psychiatric after-plan treatment was planned in 27 of patients. However, a specific appointment was given only in 24 patients. This might have resulted in a very poor follow-up rate that only 3 patients attended at least one follow-up visit in the psychiatric department. To conclude, I recommend taking a full history of suicide is necessary to manage the risk appropriately. This assessment cannot be completed if relevant information is not available. A structured approach to assessment will improve the comprehensiveness of risk assessment, thereby improve the effectiveness of treatment. So, auditing periodically our clinic work is essential to improve the quality. These are my references. Thank you.
Paper is open for questions from the floor. In your study, there is only very low follow-up rates, 10%.
Yes, sir.
What was the reason probably you could attribute for that?
As I've quoted in the study, though the specific treatment plan was made, but only appointment date have been given only for few of them, sir. Another one is that it was also an ongoing COVID pandemic.
Okay. Possibly because of pandemic.
That was.
And you also mentioned the assessment of lethality and intentionality. It's not properly mentioned, less than around 50%. What was the reason why it's not been documented? What is your assessment and assumptions based on that?
Actually, it is very, very essential in a suicidal risk assessment that lethality and intentionality should be mentioned. But then I feel that it should have been discussed. So anyone assessing suicidal risk could have discussed of it, but then it has been not documented. So it says that though we know everything, we have done everything, but then this coming to implementation, there's been always some lacking, sir. So
it's all been recorded in psychiatry department only. So how could it would have been missed?
Documentation. That is where documentation matters, sir. Like we take all efforts, make a detailed assessment, but then in minutes of thing, we just we fail to document our findings, sir.
What are the future directions you want to convey based on your study findings?
So I implement on documentation, sir, and being an audit, like we can make audit of our routine work and give feedback, and thereby improve our clinical work.
Okay. Any other questions?
Good morning, sir. Of the 30 patients, where any of them suffered from a primary psychiatric disorder, and was that documented in the case sheets, or for that follow-up visits were advised for the patient and registered for the same?
Yes, ma'am. Like these were the results, ma'am. Adjustment disorder was there in 4, depressive disorder in 3, alcohol dependence syndrome in 3, marital disharmony in 5, personality disorder in 1, nil psychiatry was in 9, and they had pending diagnosis in 3. 2 had other diagnosis. 1 patient was in delirium and other was diagnosed to have erectile dysfunction.
So with these psychiatric comorbidities, why was the follow-up was lacking, sir? At least the patients who were diagnosed with primary psychiatric disorders, should have been on follow-up with the department. So why that so, ma'am?
Actually, these patients were referred from medicine department following a suicidal attempt. Ma'am, they were not those who were primarily visiting a psychiatrist. So, like after the suicidal assessment, after the initial crisis is done, many people they fail to come back for visit, ma'am. So it is actually our role that we have to make a proper diagnosis, psychoeducate the patient on what they have been undergoing, and then we have to make a specific treatment plan and ask them for a follow-up. But though things have been done, documentations have been missing.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
The next presenter is Ramya. Ramya, welcome to the rise.
Good morning. Clinical profile of patients requiring rapid tranquilization in a tertiary care center. Introduction. Prevalence of violence and aggressive behavior in acute psychiatric services is estimated to be 10%. Medication used to treat aggression should have rapid onset of action and low side effects. Rapid tranquilization is the use of medication by parenteral route if oral medication is not possible or appropriate and urgent sedation with medication is needed. It is important to consider clinical needs and safety of patients while using rapid tranquilization. Aim of the study, to study the demographic and clinical characteristics of patients requiring rapid tranquilization admitted in a psychiatric tertiary care center. Materials and methods, a retrospective descriptive study using case records of patient who required rapid tranquilization during admission in a tertiary care postgraduate teaching institute for the last 2 months. Socio-demographic variables and clinical characteristics, including age of onset of illness, duration of illness, history of substance use, diagnosis, indications for rapid tranquilization, medications used, and number of times rapid tranquilization was used and side effects were recorded. Clinical statistical analysis, social demographic variables and clinical parameters were described using pie charts and histograms. Results. Out of the sample, 77% were male and 23% were female. 44% of them were in the age group of 21 to 30 years, while 26 were in 31 to 40 years of age, 20% were in 41 to 50 years of age, and 5% of the sample were less than 20 years of age and between 51 to 60 years of age. Majority of the population were not admitted previously, while 21% had been admitted at least once previously. 76% had no comorbid illness, while 5% had seizure disorder and 6% had hypothyroidism, and the other 13% had medical illness like diabetic hypertension. 54% of the sample did not have comorbid substance use, while 33% had substance use, and all those 33% were male. On the account of diagnosis, 36% of the sample had psychosis, while 31% had mood disorder, 28% had substance use disorder, and 5% were of intellectual disability with behavioral problems. On the count of indication for rapid tranquilization, physical aggression contributed to 56% of the sample, while 39% had verbal aggression and 5% had suicidal ideas. 93% of the sample received treatment with antipsychotics, while 7% did not receive antipsychotic treatment. In relation, on the account of RT given, 83% received combination drugs, which included either haloperidol injection with Finargan or haloperidol with lorazepam, and 17% received a single drug. Number of times RT was used during admission. 78% received RT in less than 5 times, of which 42% received RT only on a single time, and 17% received a single drug. Most of 42% required rapid tranquilization only once. 22% received rapid tranquilization more than 5 times, of which 6 samples required rapid tranquilization more than 10 times. There were no complications due to rapid tranquilization in my sample. Discussion. The study evaluated the effect of widely available drug treatments for emergency rapid tranquilization of aggressive and agitated patients with mental illness. Results from the study indicate that most prevalent diagnosis was psychosis, followed by affective disorder, which is consistent with other studies, Jeffen et al. And Pilowsky et al. Major indication for rapid tranquilization was physical aggression than verbal aggression. Intramuscular method was the only method used for rapid tranquilization in this study. However, a study by Foster et al. Found no significant interaction between administration route and improvement rate. Hence, most common method of rapid tranquilization in my institute was studied. This study found that the combination drug was most commonly used for rapid tranquilization than a single drug. And within combination, haloperidol and lorazepam was used most commonly, which is consistent with other studies. Limitations. Findings of this study relate only to rapid tranquilization administered in mental health setting and not to be generalized with other clinical settings and emergency services. Sample size was small, and there's no data regarding parental use of atypical antipsychotics. These are my references. Thank you.
Please introduce yourself.
Sir, I'm Dr. Ramya, PG from Institute of Mental Health, Chennai.
Okay. It's open for discussion.
You have mentioned about 79% without previous admission required rapid tranquilization. Is that your point here? The patient with the first psychiatric consultation required more rapid tranquilization than consequent episodes?
Yeah, that can be either attributed to it, or this is a institute where we get, it's not a general hospital setting. This is a more psychiatrically oriented hospital. Even that could have been a bias that only when patient is irritated to that level, patient seeks helps to a mental institute.
The key component in your study is rapid tranquilization. So have you defined that? Because we should know what is that being studied.
Sir, in the introduction, I think I mentioned the line, sir. The use of medication by parenteral route if oral medication is not possible or appropriate.
Suppose I give haloperidol lorazepam, after 6 hours I repeat. Can it be called rapid tranquilization? Because you have defined this is the key factor you are studying, right?
Yes, sir.
So within what is the span of time, what dose it's been used, that also be mentioned, right?
Okay.
So what is the majority of patients been given in the injections, and how frequently it was repeated, that also should be mentioned.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you say about that?
Sir, in my sample, the most commonly used injection was with combination haloperidol and lorazepam. Though repetitions were there, it was not, for most patients, it was either 2 times a day with at least 12 hours gap, or the other patients received only once a day.
So if it's a 12 hours gap, can it be called rapid tranquilization? Can it be defined? Is there any formal definitions?
I think I should get back.
Okay, what is your carry home message based on your study?
So that I just want to say that now we are using rapid tranquilizations as an urgent method when patient is not amenable to any suggestions, or when we are not able to control. I just wanted to check if there are any side effects or any adverse effects that occurs either to the patient, or if there is any other method that we can use to control such aggressive patients.
What other methods?
Actually, rapid tranquilization also includes oral medications. I didn't have any records for giving any oral medications. So even that could have been tried. And even though there are, since such medications are not available in our institute, we don't use. There are atypical antipsychotics which are now available that have been used for rapid tranquilization. So I just wanted to study with whatever is available to us, which method is most commonly used and how patients respond to it.
One of my suggestion is when you present, the key variables should be properly defined. Then only we can take into account the various statistical means. So the key variable should be properly defined and it should be mentioned. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next presenter, Dr. Nasrin Fatima.
Good morning, one and all. I am here to present a study of socio-demographic factors and clinical features affecting readmission rates in schizophrenia and bipolar affective disorder. A retrospective chart analysis. This is me, Dr. Nasrin Fatima, third year postgraduate from Institute of Mental Health, and the study is guided by Dr. Vimal Doshi, Dr. Shanti Makeshwari, Dr. Meena Enam, Assistant Professors, Department of Psychiatry, and Dr. Purna Chandrika, Head of the Department of Psychiatry, Institute of Mental Health, Chennai. So schizophrenia and bipolar affective disorder are the two major psychiatric illnesses that requires multiple hospital admission. Readmission rates is found to be an important quality marker in patient care in schizophrenia and also in bipolar affective disorder. So readmission occurs earlier when the duration of index admission is less as per the previous studies. Vasudeva et al. In 2019 reported that the length of initial admission is the only predictor for readmission. So the aim of this study is to study the socio-demographic factors and clinical features associated with readmission rates in patients with schizophrenia and bipolar affective disorder, which can possibly influence the services delivered. Materials and methods. This is a retrospective chart analysis of case records of patients registered at Institute of Mental Health, Chennai during January 2018 to March 2018, diagnosed as schizophrenia and bipolar affective disorder, who are followed up to a period of 3 years till August 2021. Now, socio-demographic variables like age, gender, occupation, education, and clinical parameters like diagnostic subtype, presence of substance use, duration of index hospital stay in days, and number of readmissions were collected. The sample is divided into 3 groups depending on the duration of stay during index hospital admission as group 1, 0 to 7 days, group 2, 8 to 15 days, and group 3, more than 15 days. Descriptive statistics done for socio-demographic variables and clinical features represented by the tables. And the results and discussion of the study, 120 samples of schizophrenia and 114 samples of bipolar affective disorders were collected. And of that, most of them were males, accounting for about 75 to 80% of the sample. And in case of schizophrenia, about 65% were married, and in bipolar affective disorder, 64% were married, and bipolar affective disorder were more employed than schizophrenia people, and about 50% of the sample had a secondary educations done, primary and secondary education completed. And of the comorbidities, metabolic comorbidities comprise the most common comorbidities in both the groups, and followed by hypothyroidism. Most of them had no substance use, and alcohol was the most common substance consumed by 2 groups. And most common subtype in schizophrenia comprised of paranoid subtype, accounting for about 88%, and the most common subtype in bipolar affective disorder requiring admission comprised of mania. And duration of hospital stay, about 75 to 80% of the individuals required around 15 days for admission. And most of the parentals were used in the bipolar affective disorder group, and much of the parentals were used during the first 3 days of the admissions. And in the readmission, in the schizophrenia group, about 16 males were readmitted and 13 females were readmitted. And in the bipolar subtype group, 23 males were admitted and 10 females were readmitted.
the samples had a previous study done only with the schizophrenia sample, and in that study, Mann-Whitney U test and Fisher exact T test were admitted, and which found that there was no influence of the physical comorbidities or substance use or the subtype affecting readmission. And using Mann-Whitney U test, it was also concluded that the duration of index hospital stay did not have any influence on the readmission rates, which was against the studies done previously, which suggested that the length of initial hospital admissions, if prolonged, can reduce readmission. So the limitations of the studies are, it is a retrospective chart analysis study, small sample size, and medication adherence and admissions outside the place of study are not included, and only the descriptive statistics of this sample was mentioned here. And this is an ongoing study planned for about 150 cases of schizophrenia and 150 cases of bipolar affective disorder, whose readmission rates are to be compared. The interim descriptive statistics are presented in the study. Results of the complete study would help in better understanding of both the disorders and for future policy making in the community psychiatric side. These are my references. I thank my institute who gave this opportunity to present the study in this platform. I thank you one and all for the opportunity. Thank you.
It's open for discussion. So what is your basic understanding about based on this study? This is an ongoing study anyway. And what directions you want to give and guide us?
Sir, previously the study only with the schizophrenia sample, we had concluded that the duration of hospital admission does not have any influence on the readmission, sir, because if the patient is discharged within the 3 days, or if the admission is prolonged to institutionalization, that is more than 1 year also, there has been readmission rates. And also being a tertiary care hospital and in the amidst the COVID pandemics, we couldn't account for the readmissions which have been done outside the place of study, and also transportations and admissions were restricted during this COVID periods. So we couldn't conclude that this is the actual scenario of readmission, or whether it would have been in excess if this pandemic period is out. So our conclusion was whether the patient has been prolonged for admission during the index hospital stay or discharged immediately, only with the services which being followed up, like medication adherence or community follow-up, because district mental health services have been available in every district, sir. So liaison with that could influence the readmission rates in the community, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
The next presenter is Dr. Shalaka Anand Chatorika. She is attending online, sir.
Yes, you shall start, please.
Shalaka, you can start the presentation now.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. Sorry, just a second. Sorry, are my slides visible now?
Yeah.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Shalaka Chaturikar, Junior Resident of Psychiatry from Kasturba Medical College, Manipal, and I'll be presenting a case series titled Effectiveness and Safety of Maintenance Electroconvulsive Therapy in Schizophrenia, a case series. So as we know that schizophrenia is a chronic debilitating psychiatric disorder with a considerable heterogeneity over long term. The effect of the antipsychotics that we give tends to decrease over time, and this increases the risk of relapse in these patients. Now, relapse can have serious implications in, say, clinical course or even the biological progression of the disease, the risk of suicide, even the reintegration into society of these patients. Now, we use electroconvulsive therapy or ECT as a useful adjunct to this antipsychotic during acute care. Now, MECT is used to reduce the risk of relapse after 6 months of remission of symptoms. There is sufficient evidence to support the efficacy of MECT in combination with antidepressants when we speak about major depressive disorders. However, the evidence supporting the long-term use of MECT in schizophrenia is scanty. So the aim of my case series is to evaluate the effectiveness and safety of maintenance electroconvulsive therapy in patients with schizophrenia. So here we did a retrospective chart review of ECT registers from 2013 to 2021 at the Department of Psychiatry, KMC, Manipal. The tools we used to collect was a socio-demographic proforma. We also charted the illness characteristics, a basic outline of how the MECT procedure was, any adverse events if they happened, and the course of the illness of the patient pre and post the MECT. We also rated the CGI-S scores, the SOFA scores, as well as the HMSC before the initiation and after the last session of the MECT, and we compared these scores. Now, this is just a basic outline of the MECT procedure that is followed in our hospital. Now, the results. We took 10 patients, 7 of whom were males and 3 of whom were females. The most common indication for initiating MECT was persistent psychotic symptoms, may it be delusions or persistent auditory hallucinations. So the mean duration of the illness was around 24.8 years. Mean age of onset of the illness was 18.2 years. Now, coming to the ECT characteristics, the average number of MECTs given was 60. Average stimulus dose, median stimulus dose was 420, and the median seizure duration was 43. So we charted the SOFAs, the CGIs, and the HMSC score before and after the MECT, and we found that there was a significant decrease in the SOFA score and the CGI score after the MECT. Whereas even though there was a change in the HMSC scores, it was not statistically significant. The results of my study are that there was a significant improvement in the severity of the illness and the overall functioning before and after the initiation of the MECT. And there was no significant deterioration in global cognitive functions with the MECT. There was improvement in distress associated with the positive symptoms. There was a reduction in the number of hospitalizations, episodes of aggression, participation in activities in rehabilitation center, etc. Now, a study shows significant improvement in overall functioning and severity of the illness. Though the Cochrane review says that there is limited evidence for ECT in treatment-resistant schizophrenia, and most of the evidence comes from case reports and series, there have been 2 important randomized controlled trials that we need to keep in mind, both of which have evaluated the efficacy of MECT along with antipsychotics and long-term management of schizophrenia. And both have said that yes, MECT has a significant advantage. Also, they speak about a symptom-driven approach to the frequency of the MECT. So whenever there is an occurrence of suicidal ideations or any exacerbation of positive symptoms of violence towards others, we can adjust the MECT frequency, make it more frequent if required. Finally, the concerns regarding the cognitive impairment are addressed as well. So because this is a maintenance ECT and this is not happening every alternate day, the adequate spacing that we give gives time for neuronal recovery. And this, our study shows no significant deterioration in global cognitive functions, whereas there is one study who shows significant improvement as well. The strength of my study is that we used SOFAs and CGI score to show overall improvement. There was treatment refractoriness in most of our patients, and the average number of MECTs was 70, which is more than seen in any other studies. Limitations being a retrospective design, small sample size, and lack of any standardized scale to measure specific ECT-related cognitive deficits. I just want to say that MECT is a safe and effective option in long-term management of schizophrenia, and we should consider this as an option for an early course of the illness to prevent relapse. And controlled trials are definitely implicated in this area. Thank you.
Yes, the paper is open for discussion. Any questions? So my question to the presenter is, what is the average number of maintenance ECT given in your sample? What is the minimum number and maximum number, or what period?
We took it over from 2013 to 2021, so that's around 7 to 8 years. The minimum number of MECTs that we found in our sample was 40, and the maximum was 172. So that was a range, and the average number of MECTs that we found was around 60.
What is your suggestion regarding instead of going for MECT, why can't we adjust the dosage? What is your opinion about based on your samples and study?
Dosage of medications, sir?
Yeah. Change of medications.
Yes,
Variations of medication that may be helpful instead of going for ECT. I agree that ECT is a very good treatment, acute phase of management. Instead of going for a maintenance ECT, why can't we change the dose? What is your opinion based on your study?
So given that most of the patients that do require, say, maybe a higher dose of antipsychotics or maintenance ECT that we have seen were patients who were treatment resistant to the medications that we had started them on initially. So instead of going higher up on medications, which can also significantly increase the risk of side effects associated with the said medications, ECT is definitely a safer option, and we can consider starting an MECT session earlier instead of just trying to hike up and seeing how they react to medications. Given that MECT has evidence of being effective, and as well as if we are considering the cognitive impairment, it has shown that MECT, because they spaced it out, helps in neuronal recovery. So we should not worry about that as well. So MECT is definitely a better option.
In your study sample, patients requiring MECT, which drugs have been predominantly required MECT? Whether it was risperidone maintenance or clozapine maintenance, which are the population require more MECT?
Yes, sir. So the population sample that we took from was from our rehabilitation center. So most of them were on clozapine.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Sir, as the duration of the study is so long, what are the attrition rate in this study, and how they convince the patient for this continuous treatment, and what are the challenges they faced to advise the patients regarding the continuation of the maintenance ECT?
Yes, thank you for the question. All of our patients that we took up for this study are a part of our rehabilitation center. So at Manipal, we have a rehabilitation center which is Home Belapur. So it's a long-term care center for patients, let's say, treatment refractory schizophrenia or bipolar patients. So they are there for a very long time. So we've taken specifically these patients who are on MECT and are in our rehabilitation center.
So if so, ma'am, what are the challenges would be if so done in the community setting, in the outpatient department setting?
In the outpatient department setting, definitely one thing will be the compliance to the MECT, like bringing them, say, every month or every 2 weekly, or however it is that you plan the ECT. But apart from that, if we psychoeducate them properly and give them the advantages and the benefits of MECT, we can ensure them coming back for sessions as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
The final presenter is Dr. Jay Karthik. He's attending online, sir.
Okay.
Is my screen visible, sir?
Yes, we shall proceed.
Good morning to the chairperson, Dr. Ananda Krishna Kumar sir, and all the delegates who are present. Myself, Dr. Jay Karthik, final year postgraduate from GSL Hospital, Rajahmundry. My study topic will be comparison of sexual functioning and satisfaction in individuals with and without tobacco use disorder. So substance use disorders are highly prevalent and cause a significant burden on society and family. Tobacco being the most commonly used psychoactive substance. Global Adult Tobacco Survey reported tobacco prevalence of 28.6% in all adults. Substance use disorders have been identified to impair sexual functioning and satisfaction. Tobacco being the most prevalent substance use, it is vital to study its impact on human sexuality, as it can significantly affect the individual's well-being, self-esteem, and self-confidence. But there aren't adequate studies to prove its impact, hence the need for this study. Aim to study and compare the sexual functioning and satisfaction in individuals with and without tobacco use disorder. Objectives: to assess the sexual functioning in individuals with tobacco use disorder and compare with controls. To assess the sexual satisfaction in individuals with tobacco use disorder and compare with controls. So individually, we are going to assess sexual functioning and satisfaction and compare them with controls. Materials and methodology: it's a case control study conducted in GSL Medical College Hospital on outpatients, caretakers, and staffs of GSL institutions, Rajanagaram. Study period will be for a period of 1.5 years, and because of COVID pandemic, and on 100 cases and under controls. Inclusion criteria will be tobacco use disorder patients diagnosed under DSM-5, male married population, age group 21 to 45 years, patient who give informed consent, and sexually active individuals. Exclusion criteria will be any other substance abuse, any other psychiatric disorders, or organic condition which may contribute to sexual dysfunction, or medications commonly associated with sexual dysfunction. Tools used will be MiniPlus to rule out any psychiatric disorder, assist scale to rule out any other substance use, DSM-5 criteria to confirm the diagnosis of tobacco use disorder, assessing sexual function through changes in sexual functioning questionnaire, and assessing sexual satisfaction through a male sexual quotient self-assessment questionnaire. Ethical consideration: written informed consent is mandatory and institutional ethical clearance is obtained. Statistical analysis, SPS 21.0 and chi-square test, and for statistical analysis, P less than 0.05 is considered significant. Results: this is my sociodemographic data, and from our study we found that majority, almost 35.4% of dysfunction among cases were from 25 to 30 years, and when employment status was considered, 78.48% of dysfunction among cases were from skilled laborers, and socioeconomic class, almost 82.3% dysfunction among cases from lower middle class. These three are not statistically significant. This is statistically significant. Sexual dysfunction, when we saw 79% of the cases who smoked tobacco had sexual dysfunction, whereas only 27% of the controls had sexual dysfunction. This was statistically significant. So the scale which was used was CSFQ score. Total CSFQ score less than 47 signifies dysfunction. Cases had a mean of 34.62, whereas controls had a mean of 50.21. Individual domains of desire, interest, pleasure, arousal, and orgasm were studied. Sexual desire less than 8 signifies dysfunction. Cases had a mean of 5.48, whereas controls had a mean of 8.46. Sexual interest less than 11 signifies dysfunction. Cases had a mean of 7.45, whereas controls had a mean of 11.39. Sexual pleasure less than 4 signifies dysfunction. Cases had a mean of 2.53, whereas controls had a mean of 4.39. Sexual arousal less than 13 signifies dysfunction. Cases had a mean of 7.51, whereas controls had a mean of 13.21. Sexual orgasm less than 11 signifies dysfunction. Cases had a mean of 7.01, whereas controls had a mean of 12.80. Another scale which was used was male sexual quotient questionnaire. It found that for dissatisfaction, 70% of the cases had dissatisfaction, whereas only 10% of the controls had dissatisfaction. So discussion: this study was undertaken to study impact of tobacco use on a person's sexuality. We found that 35.4% of cases in age group 25 to 30 have sexual dysfunction. Rosen et al. Found that 11% men in their late 20s have one or other sexual dysfunction. Rose et al. Found that lower socioeconomic class had higher prevalence. In our study, 82.3% of sexual dysfunction among lower middle class was observed. The current study has shown decrease in sexual functioning among cases to be 79, whereas controls only 27. This was resulted in Bible et al. Study. The study showed 70% of the cases had sexual dissatisfaction. In another study, it was shown that 32.9% of dissatisfaction was among smokers. Since we included all tobacco, prevalence was high. This current study showed significant decline in sexual desire. Haab et al. Found that 23% decrease in sexual desire in nicotine-dependent patients was found. McQuarrie et al. Found that smoking affects erection by impairment of endothelium dependent smooth muscle relaxation and increases erectile dysfunction by 2-fold. These findings are also reflected in our study. Our finding found that sexual arousal, there is declining 79%. Conclusion: there is statistically significant decrease in sexual function and satisfaction in individuals with tobacco use disorder than those who don't use tobacco. Early identification and screening for these detrimental changes can improve the quality of life of the patient, reduce psychological distress, create awareness, and can motivate, in some cases, motivate abstinence among tobacco users. Limitations of the study: the female partners were not studied, and the sample size is less to generalize to a general population. These are my references. Thank you.
Study is open for discussion.
My question is, how you got 100 samples without any comorbid conditions, only using tobacco? They usually don't come with tobacco dependence for de-addiction.
It didn't come to psychiatry directly. We took it from TBCD department and medicine department, and who had comorbidities we had to filter out, and that's why the period we initially planned it for 6 months, but it took a lot of time, 1.5 years. So that was the time. That was the reason for the delay in the study. It took almost 1.5 years for us to complete it.
Patient with the comorbid condition, it might be a confounding factor for the sexual.
Yeah, it is. Studies have found that hyperlipidemia, hypertension, they can impair the relaxation of smooth muscle in penis, which can result in sexual dysfunction. So that's why we took those organic conditions. Spinal injury can result in decreased erection in men. So that's why we took those as coma. Those we had to rule out to prove that tobacco use actually results in sexual dysfunction.
Even patients with DM neuropathy can lead to sexual dissatisfaction, erectile dysfunction. Have you had any comorbid conditions like diabetes?
Diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, everything as a comorbid to rule out. All, including spinal injury, everything was included. Even medications which can result in sexual dysfunction, we also had to rule them out.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
What are the implications of the study and what is future directions based on the study?
Sir, usually tobacco dependent patients, it is very difficult to motivate them. Any substance abuse, it's very difficult to motivate them. But if we, in that 21 to 45 years, if we are able to make them understand that, yeah, tobacco dependence can result in sexual dysfunction, which is actually going to be helpful for their future family, maybe there can be motivation and insight among tobacco users, and which can result in abstinence, is what we thought of before starting the study, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, I welcome Dr. Arun Kumar to honor our chairperson.